to call the meeting of Ordinance Committee today, 12/11/17 at 6:45. Looks like all in our attendance. We won't do a roll call, we'll just do a visual. We have Council President, Mayor, Safety Service Director, Assistant Law Director, Auditor, Treasurer, and members, soon-to-be councilmen in attendance. Move to accept the attendance. Right, we have to do that today. It's been a while. All right. Agenda number A17 dash.
Excuse me, I think we need to excuse the law director.
Do we have?
I move that. I move.
Oh, we have to excuse a law director from a committee meeting?
He's not.
No, I don't believe we do, but
We normally do.
He doesn't have to attend. Frank's the one that attends.
Frankson is here, and I just take
He
attendance.
just
of
comes
those.
if he wants to.
That's correct.
Okay. We will continue on with agenda item A17-38, which is add a section to the ACO pertaining to food and vendor carts and trucks. We have a moratorium with respect to the operation of mobile food units and declaring an emergency. Brought to the table again, or off the table from Mayor Costello. Would you like to speak and kind of bring this back to, bring us back up to speed with where we're at on this?
Don't really have much to say. The temporary restrictions that council put on the food trucks is expired, I believe, or nearing expiration. The fire chief has told me that the state hasn't completely finalized all of their rules. So I truly just think it's in the best interest of the city if council would extend either the moratorium or those temporary regulations for a longer period of time until council has a chance to revisit this the first of the year.
So our understanding is that we should just, or your recommendations, we wait until the state hands down their ORC codes for fire in regards to mobile trucks, and then...
No, I'm not saying wait. I'm saying we should pass these temporary regulations and then revisit the what ordinances we want to write.
We should wait,
permanently
right, so we should
first year.
wait to debate this legislation and create new ordinance so we can get the ORC.
I'm not suggesting wait. I think we could have done this, but being it's late in the year, let's pass this extension and debate it first of the year.
Fair enough. Mr. Carlson, do you have anything you want to add, or anybody else wants to add?
No, just to second what the mayor said. I also talked to the fire chief, and he said apparently the regulations are still in the works. So I believe it makes sense to continue the moratorium with the temporary regulations until we know what the state does. We don't want to be necessarily inconsistent with the state regulations. We may want to supplement them in some way, but that's the law director's opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Council, any discussion or comment on this issue? Mr. Janik?
I've got two items or questions, I guess, relating to the last time we brought this up. The first is item G under smoking and the description. How will this be enforced, I guess is the question. Who will enforce this and how will it be enforced?
Go ahead, Mr. Carlson.
Well, I presume that, I suppose the building department could raise the issue, the fire department could raise the issue, the police could raise the issue. I don't know how likely any of that is. I suppose if there were complaints received about how the food units were being operated, and one of them may be that people were smoking outside around them in a way that offended passers-by, then somebody's going to step up and enforce the regulation.
I guess I ask because on any given weekend night, you can see a lot of people outside smoking, even in the winter, I think.
Right.
So I'm just wondering on that. And then item L, being that this will be effective until July 1st of 2018, and dancing on Main Street doesn't occur till August, do we want to include that or just strike it? Or
I would include it just in case the date changes. I mean, it's not hurting
Okay.
anything being there.
all right, and for planning purposes, I guess. Okay.
So, Mr. Janik, you would like to see L, the ordinance will not apply to dancing on Main Street to continue, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I guess for planning purposes, so that they know that it includes, but item G, I don't know how, again,
I suppose it's enforced just like any of the other non-smoking rules. I mean, there's non-smoking rules in effect now with all the businesses and, you know, outside businesses, so I assume it's the same enforcement that would be.
okay. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janik. Mr. Van Chern?
Item G, this doesn't matter one whit, but there's a sentence that says no smoking sign shall be consciously posted inside each mobile food unit. I think that should say conspicuously.
Conspicuously.
You can't unconsciously post this. I guess you could.
Oh, yeah.
I think the ordinance should be corrected in that respect. The position of the assistant law director is that is not an amendment, but a correction that we can make before it goes to council.
Thank you, Mr. Van Chern. Mr. Carlson? Any other comments or questions, concerns on this issue?
It's my understanding that this doesn't apply to if somebody has a vending truck on private property. Is that right?
I think it still would.
No, yeah, I think it applies throughout the city.
Okay. Just a question.
Mr. Carlson, may I clarify something on that then?
Yes.
So does this right now moratorium completely ban then all food trucks? Or just these restrictions must be upheld, whether it be on private property or on public streets?
Well, I know that council has raised the issue of the use of the word moratorium under these circumstances. In fact, what we're saying is we're not going to permit them unless you abide by these temporary regulations. I think it's the best way to look at it. So to call it an outright moratorium where you're saying they can't do it, that's not correct. You're saying you can do it, but you have to abide by these regulations. So it's kind of an interim measure that uses the word moratorium.
Thank you. I was hoping we'd get that cleared. So on, whether it be on private or public property right now, they just have to follow these guidelines, these restrictions,
Yes.
correct? Very good. I'd be curious to see the new fire code. I'd like to get this moratorium. I'm not a big fan of moratoriums or temporary. I think we should write legislation to make it work and be effective and get it in the books. So as soon as that comes in, I look forward to seeing this back here.
I understand that. I would like to comment, just in my limited experience, the city went through the same thing with the sweepstakes cafe issue. And there were efforts made to kind of create a regulation. And then all of a sudden, what happened is the state kind of preempted the whole area. So I do think it makes sense to wait first, in this case, to see what the state does.
Thank you. I'd agree with you as well. Mr. Van Chern?
One more thing, and I hope this isn't a silly question, but you had mentioned private property and whether this applied to food trucks that are on private property. There's nothing in here that would stop food truck owners from parking and storing their food truck on their private property if they weren't operating into the city. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, that's all.
And that's under that first section 1, letter A, the moratorium on the operation.
So that
So-
specifically
right,
means
and I just want
running
to
and
clarify
selling.
that. I agree, clarifying that is important right now, as we have somebody that can park one temporarily in their driveway.
Right.
It's a good question, good catch there. Mr. Carlson, you agree with that, just the
I do.
operation? All right, thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns from council or administration? Mr. Treasurer?
The restriction that I read under C is that no mobile food unit using liquid propane gas or any other combustible fuel shall operate on any street or public property in the city of Amherst within 15 feet of a building permanent structure or parked vehicle. I think what this does, it says that it would permit the operation of a food truck with those sorts of combustibles on private property, or would it permit the operation of a food truck that doesn't use any combustibles on public property? See, my concern about this was, it was confusing to me the first time it came through. I expressed that. I still think it's confusing. Those are the questions I have.
So, Mr. Ramsey, the concern is this looks like it bans this C, section 1C. May just ban them in general from operating.
On any street or public property,
Which-
which says anything about private property.
Right.
And then,
all right,
so go ahead, Frank, yeah.
Well, I think that some of the regulations don't apply in all situations. I guess the implication of that is you're right, that somebody could have a liquefied propane tank on a mobile food unit that was on private property. That doesn't still mean that none of the regulations apply to private property, because the regulations relating to fire extinguishers, for example, or insurance, and those other factors would apply.
Certainly.
So, but I appreciate the question.
And I guess the question also becomes, can I sell, cold, can I sell salads, something that doesn't require cooking, am I able to sell that on a public street because I'm not using liquid propane gas or combustible fuel?
Ice cream.
If I was selling ice cream. for
Yes, I mean, you
instance.
could, but the other requirements might also have to be met.
So when there was discussion earlier about how this was almost a ban of food carts among the city, I don't view it that way, or at least that's the way I'm reading it. So I just want everybody to be on the same page, that's all.
I think we're kind of spinning our wheels until the state comes out with their regulations, because you may end up changing and rewriting this whole thing practically. You never know.
I would think that's probable, yeah.
So the suggestions are good, but still, I think, this thing should probably be tabled, or just a moratorium be put back in place until the state comes out with their stuff, and then put the ordinance together and, make the changes. So, because whatever we do may not work.
I think you're still going to be confronted with the problem that you had last summer, though. So somebody comes downtown and they start to operate without any regulation.
Oh,
So if we table this, we don't pass the extension.
no, I don't mean,
Then it's unregulated.
I don't mean
Yeah.
to table it, Frank. I mean just to extend what we have
I
until
see.
the state comes out with what their rules and regulations are gonna be, and then go from there,
Yes,
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson, Mr. President. I think the point that Mr. Ramsey brought up is a good point, because it's talking about public property, public streets, and not private property. And it looks like if somebody wants to put one on their private property, and I'm not talking residential, we're talking commercial, because I believe there's some residential restrictions for what you can operate that's already on code that I remember reading, and I'm sorry that I can't provide them out of my memory. I have to go back to the ACO. But I believe that this not on private property still allows people to put a mobile truck on private property, and if it meets all these safety and fire conditions, they could technically operate it, and I'm okay with that on private property. Now, looking at downtown, I don't think there's any private property that will fit within this, and I think Mr.
We have to recess
Leminski-
this and go into council, and then recess council and come back to this if you want to.
We need to start council at
Yeah.
7 o'clock.
Okay, so I'm gonna guess we're gonna need either a motion to move this on with emergency, or to table discussion so we can open council. Mr. Winarski?
My suggestion and motion would be to go into recess, to go into committee or council, recess out of that, and then come back into committee.
Okay, so we're going to have to table,
No,
No.
recess.
or just recess? We have a motion on the floor to recess committee to go into council. Mr. Ventura?
Second?
Second on the floor. All those in favor of recessing signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Recess at 7:01.
You can come back.
Thanks, Ms. Holden. After you.
Pardon me? No. We're going to council, recess, and then go back into committee. It's a clock issue. This is what I'm told, yeah.
After I read the consent agenda.
We can't start early, but we
Consent agenda and then we can recess.
no, we're on the clock. We have to start council at 8.
Oh, I see.
Or
Okay.
7.
Yes.
The other time's on.
You ready?
Bouncing around.
Regular meeting of Amherst City Council will come to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Present.
Mr. Winarski?
Here.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Here.
Mr. Van Turen?
Here.
Mr. Janik?
Here.
Mr. Cowger?
Here.
We'll stand for the prayer by Chaplain Silk and remain standing for the pledge of the flag by Sergeant Arms Dubinsky.
Will you bow with me, please? Gracious God, bless this meeting tonight. Guide our thoughts and our actions. Keep us all within your care. And bless us all with the joy of the upcoming holidays and good health in the coming new year. And now may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Mr. Winarski.
I'd like to make a motion that we go, we recess council and reconvene committee.
Thank you. Need a second? Mr. Miller?
Second, please.
Motion second on the floor to recess council so that we may resume our committee meetings. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Like sign, we are recessed at 7:05.
Oh, I can do committee. I can do
Jennifer
committee.
Jennifer has a meeting too.
Okay.
It's like committee.
To call the ordinance committee meeting back to, how's it, 7:06? Okay. We left off with discussion on agenda A1738. Do we have any other discussion in regards to the moratorium on the food truck that was presented with emergency? Mr. Winarski?
I'd like to motion to send this to the floor of council as written, please. Does that include the emergency when I say as written?
Yes, does include the emergency as written. Correct. Thank you, Mr. Winarski. Mr. Deminsky?
I'll second that.
We have a motion on the floor to move out of committee to the floor of council A1738, an ordinance extending a moratorium with respect to the operation of mobile food units and declaring an emergency. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. Mr. Deminsky?
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Cowger?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. Adjourn at 7:07. Call the meeting of the Finance Committee to order at 7:08 PM on the 11th of December 2017. We will use the attendance from the council meeting, to which we're recessed right now. We have two agenda items, A 17-65, reappropriate funds for salaries and wages in the Water Pollution Control Department. Mr. Kukuka, do you want that with the emergency?
Yes, please.
Mr. Kukuka, would you care to comment?
Yeah, doing our last payroll of the year, we noticed that the salary and wages line is coming up a little bit short. And again, just need a couple $1,000 just to get us through this last payroll.
Okay, Mr. Cowger.
I'd like to make a motion to take A 1765 to the floor council with the emergency.
Thank you. Mr. Janik.
Second?
There's a motion and a second to take A 17-65 to the floor of council with the emergency. Are there any further comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0, and A 17-65 goes to the floor of council with the emergency. Second item I have is A 17-66, increase appropriation in part-time wages account 100-1001-52405, declaring an emergency. Mr. Kukuka, you requested this on behalf of Mr. Pecora and yourself. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, the law department's clerk down in Overland has resigned, and she is entitled to payout of her vacation. She does have some vacation time accrued, so the law department does not have that in their enough money in their budget to pay that, so we have to increase the appropriation in that line item, and able to make that happen. So that's why we requested this.
So this is Overland Municipal Clerk of Courts?
Yes, ma'am.
No,
Time.
it's
Or-
not the clerk of courts, it's actually the prosecutor's office at Overland Municipal Court, which is separate from the clerk of courts. And I'd just like to say that Dina McCruskey had been a part-time employee of the city for a period of time. She found full-time employment. She was an excellent and loyal employee of the city of Amherst. I just want to acknowledge that.
I'd like to concur.
She-
In my view,
she's
I think
an-
She's a great person.
But she's an Amherst employee. Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
she's
I
an
just wanna make
Amherst
sure.
employee. Yeah.
She was a clerk for the prosecutor's office, and she actually worked not only for Amherst, but she also worked for like Wellington and other
Yeah.
cities as well.
Oh, okay, all
Yeah.
right. And this is our portion of that. Okay, all right. Okay. All right, very good. Thank you. Mr. Miller,
Move take A 17-66 to the floor of council with emergency.
okay? Mr. Cow,
Second.
there's a motion and a second to take A 17-66 to the floor of council with the emergency. Are there any further comments or questions? Mr. Winarski?
I apologize in advance. I know this is probably a stupid question, but I see where we're taking money and putting it somewhere. Where does it come from?
This actually comes from the general fund.
Okay, so, all right. That's it, thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
all.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. A 17-66 goes to the floor of council with the emergency. Mr. Miller,
Move to adjourn, please.
Mr. Calver.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. We are adjourned at 7:12 p.m. Thank you.
So unless you put it by box, they're buying it. It is. It's a big count.
But they're up north.
Oh, good.
Ready, kid? Amherst City Council, we reconvene at 7:14. Move on to item 5, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items,
Consent agenda.
oh, I'm sorry, yes, the consent agenda, item 4.
Minutes of the regular council meeting held November 27th, 2017. Minutes of the ordinance committee meeting held December 11th, 2017. Minutes of the finance committee meeting held December 11th, 2017.
Mr. Miller,
Move to accept consent agenda as read, please.
Mr. Winarski,
I'll second.
motion is second on the floor to accept the consent agenda as read. Any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Calver?
Yes.
Motion carries. Move on to item 5, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items on tonight's agenda. Anyone wishing to speak on anything on tonight's agenda? Mr. Janik.
Should we have excused the law director? He has a letter on the file.
Yes,
I'd like to
we
make
should.
that
We
motion.
can do that now, thank you.
Mr. Van Turen,
Second.
are you officially excusing the law director, Mr. Janik?
Yes, I made the motion.
Second by Mr. Van Turen. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Law director is excused. Any other items on item 5? If not, we'll move on to item 6, ordinances and resolutions. First reading, item A.
An ordinance extending a moratorium with respect to the operation of mobile food units and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Van Turen.
Move to adopt.
Mr.
Move to suspend. I know that. I don't know what happened.
Second longest
Move to
tenure.
suspend council rules so that item 6A can be adopted on its first reading.
Thank you, Mr. Van Turen. Mr. Dembinski.
It's like Joe Miller now.
Motion is second on the floor to suspend council rules on item A, so may be passed on the first reading. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. What is it?
Motion to adopt.
I'm sorry. Mr. Janik.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Winarski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01752.
How soon we forget. Item B,
An ordinance reappropriating funds in WPCC accounts and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so item 6B may be passed on the first reading.
Ms. Winarski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to suspend council rules. Item B so may be passed on the first reading. Any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Motion carries. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01753.
Item C,
An ordinance to increase appropriations in Law Department part-time wages, account 100-706-52113, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so item 6C may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Miller.
Second, please.
Motion is second on the floor to suspend council rules. Item C so may be passed on the first reading. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Mr. Miller.
Move to adopt, please.
Mr. Cogger.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01754.
That completes item 6. Move on to item 7, ordinances and resolutions second reading. We have none. Move on to item 8, ordinances and resolutions third reading. Item A,
An ordinance establishing the salary of the auditor of the City of Amherst for the years 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
To adopt item 8A.
Mr. Miller.
Second, please.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01755.
Item B,
An ordinance establishing the salary of the treasurer of the City of Amherst for the years 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adopt 8B.
Mr. Cogger.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Item B, roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01756.
Item C,
An ordinance establishing the salaries for the members of council for the years 2018 and 2019, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Miller.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Cogger.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
No.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
No.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
You'll be ordinance 01757.
Item D,
An ordinance establishing the salary for the clerk of council for the years 2018 and 2019 and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Miller,
Move to adopt.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second?
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
I see that. Thank you very much. It'll be ordinance 01758. No hesitation by Mr. Winarski either.
Oh, heavens, no.
He knows. Item E,
An ordinance establishing the salaries and benefits for the Amherst Fire Department effective January 1st, 2018, and repealing all ordinances in conflict herewith and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Miller,
Move to adopt.
Mrs. Pasil.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote. Mr. Carlson.
Yes, but before we vote, I have to point out that there is not an amendment, but a typographical mistake on the ordinance. That the overtime period, the minimum of 2 hours between the period of 12 p.m. or 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It says 11 a.m. to 7 a.m. That was my clerical mistake. The actual agreement between the administration and the fire department is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. So I don't characterize this as an amendment. I think we can pass it with that correction.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson.
You're welcome.
Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
It'll be ordinance 01759. Mr. Carlson, I'll just reprint the first page with the correction on it
Thank you.
as it is. Thank you.
Completes item 8. Move on, item 9, miscellaneous acknowledgement of the public. Anyone here wishing to speak on any item? Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Actually, I'm glad to see that the fire race has just passed. I actually called them out to my house the other day. We had a carbon monoxide detector go off. They were very quick, they were very professional. Luckily, it was just a faulty detector. But I want to make the call that if anybody doesn't have a CO detector, they're only about 20 bucks at Lowe's or Home Depot. It's cheap insurance, you should go get one. That was all, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dembinski. Anyone else? If not, move on to item 10, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules. Oh, I'm sorry, we had, yes, you all have a copy of a liquor request there from Dolgan Midwest LLC for Dollar General. This is basically a formality. It's very hard to do anything about these. I think Mr. Carlson would agree with me that it's hard to.
I agree. I think
Yeah.
that unless there's some substantial basis for denying the permit, pretty
So.
much.
So basically, it's a formality to let us know what's going on, so. Move on to item 10, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules.
I have nothing, Mr. President.
Thank you. Move on to item 11, reports of administration.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Kukuka?
My final reports for November have been distributed to all council. And from my office, I'd like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And I'd like to wish everybody the best. Treat everybody well. Take care of your constituents. Be good to each other. Thank you. On your report.
Thank you. Mr. Ramsey?
Our November reports have been distributed as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carlson?
I'm not aware that the law director has a report.
Very good. Mr. Jeffries?
No report.
Thank you. I'd just like to comment that two of our longest-standing elected officials are going to leave us after tonight. And I really do appreciate their many years of service that they've put in for the city. I've enjoyed working with them. Mr. Dietrich especially, your wisdom and your knowledge of the city is going to be missed. I know where you're at, so, you know, I will call on you when I need to. But I just want to thank them both for their services. I want to wish them the best with their future endeavors, and I'm sure the city's going to miss you, so thank you. And to everybody else, and Mr. Diedrich and Mr. Kuka, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and again, like I said, a good luck with both of you in the future.
Thank you.
And the report.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I was trying to sneak this in under miscellaneous acknowledgement of the public, but I'll just say it here as well. I think that all of us here at council are not only aware, but are grateful for your leadership over the years. I walked into this getting interested in issues that were going on in the city, and you were right there to guide me and those that were interested in solving problems for our constituents. So I appreciate that. You've molded me in this position. I give you a lot of credit for that, and I thank you for sometimes telling me no when I needed to hear that, and telling me yes, go. That's a battle that I'll support you on. That is a true leader, somebody that doesn't just give you what you want to hear, but tells you what's going to be the best, or gives you advice. And sometimes I listen to it, and sometimes I didn't. And I think together we have found a lot of success together. My short time here is 6. And Mr. Kukuka, I can say that as well. Many, many phone calls to the auditor's office as I learned how to do this job. And you never hesitated to answer the call, never hesitated to guide me as well, both in regards to the budget and politically. So I thank you as friends to both of you. You will be missed more than just for your resources, but you'll be missed seeing you as much as I do on council floor. So I do appreciate the council president for giving me the time, the mayor for using some of his administration's time, but I felt it necessary to get that out on the public. I think the public will realize when they're gone, and I hope that Ms. Wasok will do her due diligence to fill your shoes properly, and Mr. Piddick will learn as quickly and do as fine a job as you've done as their auditor. So with that, I yield back to Floor, and thank you for the time.
Thank you. Mr. Cogger.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the reports from the administration.
Thank you. Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to accept the reports of administration. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Item 12, acknowledge the receipt of the monthly reports from the auditor and the treasurer. Everyone had that. Mr. Miller?
Move to receipt, to acknowledge receipt of monthly reports from auditor and treasurer.
Thank you. Mr. Dembinski?
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to acknowledge the receipt of the monthly reports for the auditor and the treasurer. Roll call vote on that, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Benarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vassil?
Yes.
Mr. Venturin?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Thank you. Before we adjourn, I'd like to make a few comments. I've been around here for a long time, and I would like to say I'm happy with the progress that I've been through 5 mayors, and it's nice to acknowledge the progress that we've made in our downtown. It's really prospering and it's going super, and I know that that'll be carried on with, leave everything in good hands, so thank you. Mr. Dembinski.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, move to adjourn.
Thank you. Need a second? Mr. Winarski.
So moved.
Motion is second on the floor to adjourn. Mr. Cowger?
Do we not have to cancel the meetings for the rest of the month?
That'd be a good idea, wouldn't it? Thank you. Mr. Cowger?
I'd like to make a motion to cancel the council meeting that would be scheduled for
The 25th.
the 25th.
25th, and we'll come back on,
18th and 25th.
when do you want to have the swearing in ceremony, Jennifer?
We're still in progress.
We're still
Oh,
working on that.
okay. Tentatively, the 8th of January,
The 3rd, I think, we were talking.
the 3rd?
I think a special meeting on the 3rd to swear everybody in.
Okay.
A Wednesday?
We'll let you know. We've got to keep our.
Just
We
cancel
can call
the,
They would cancel
just
meetings for
cancel
the
the
rest of the
meetings,
year.
that's all you need to do. Just cancel the meetings.
There's motion and second on the floor to cancel the meetings for the rest of December. And you'll be, follow up with a note or acknowledgement of when you're gonna have the next meeting, so. Who seconded that? Anybody? Mr. Janet?
Second.
Motion and second on the floor to adjourn for the rest of the month. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? We're adjourned at 7:32.
We need to move, we have a motion to adjourn in a second, and we need to have a little vote on that also.
We did.
No.
No, we didn't.
Oh.
The meeting, she needs to
God, you
adjourn.
guys got me all
Yes,
discombobulated
we
there.
did.
How else are we gonna let you go?
That's right.
Roll call vote, please.
Okay, this is on adjourning this evening's meeting. Mr. Dembski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasil?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Krauger?
Yes.
We are adjourned at 7:33.
Please signed and eyes dotted or whatever.
Why we can't.